Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I was just thinking it's a sort of bit of an understatement to say that Thomas Stocker sort of finalised the report, since essentially every single word of it has been discussed, debated, argued about, and talk about writing a report by committee where you have to agree every single word of the final summary report. So it's been an enormously challenging exercise, and actually it is, in a way, unique in the annals of science that one has got a report which has got such an extraordinarily global effort attached to it. So 259 lead authors, 39 countries, thousands of papers, each of those papers peer-reviewed, the work behind most of those papers with grants before that. The depth of analysis here is absolutely extraordinary. So this isn't a sort of bunch of opinions. This is based on the most incredibly rigorous work. And what I want to do is I just want to sort of, I'm not going to attempt to do anything of what Thomas is going to do, but what I want to do is frame the challenges as I see them from my position as the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, where the job of the scientific advisor is to do just that. It is to provide the advice to policymakers. And so this slide, I think, sets out the three very difficult challenges. And each of these images is interesting in different ways. So this is a very complicated picture representing an extremely complicated set of physical phenomena that require understanding. So that is climate science. And there's been a lot of debate around the so-called pause, and I'm sure Thomas will talk about that. But what we're dealing with is incredibly complicated systems, and I have a sort of slightly biologist's approach to graphs, and I'm rather used to straight line graphs for a biologist that go like this. Physicists, of course, have straight lines which are so straight that even the fastest arrow can barely be as straight, as it were. But we're dealing with incredibly complex systems. So that's the first challenge, which is the challenge of the science. It's about understanding what's happened up until now on the basis of observation and then trying to model the future. The second challenge, which is where I start to really come in, is on the communications. This is a great slide for communicating to a scientific audience, but it's an absolutely hopeless slide for public engagement. And so one of the really big challenges is how we communicate this in a language that policymakers and indeed all of us can understand. So that's the second challenge. And then the third challenge is the challenge for the policymaker. And these are the three key issues. We've got to get the science as well as we possibly can. We've got to communicate it effectively. And then we've got to hand over to the policymakers at that point. So I've already covered this slide, really. This is the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the report. It is the most extraordinary piece of work. I think one of the difficult challenges about communicating is that we're stuck with both very big numbers and very little numbers. So people talk about a petagram of carbon. Well, I ask you, does anyone really understand what a petagram of carbon looks like? Okay, so there's another way of expressing it, which is a gigaton of carbon. Does anyone really understand what a gigaton looks like? 1,000 million tons. That, I think, is beginning to be better. And then if you can translate that into sacks of coal, well, actually, most people have forgotten what a sack of coal looks like, but roughly 20 to the ton. So getting over those very large numbers, that's the first challenge, because actually, once a number gets above 1 million, it's very, very difficult to understand it. And so, 10 gigatons, 10,000 million tons. I think that sort of starts to be a way in which we can communicate it. And then the other side of the coin is the challenge of very small numbers, where we're talking about 0.9 degrees centigrade of warming, roughly a bit less than that, since 1900. That doesn't feel like very much to most people. And I think that's another challenge. We should talk about climate warming or global warming, but that's not really the effect because, of course, as we all know, that's not evenly distributed across the surface of the planet. And I think the terminology of climate disruption is probably a better way of capturing it. But I really do believe that there's a sort of profound issue in terms of how we communicate both the big numbers and the little numbers in a way that means things to all of us. Oops. And then I think the second thing is that one's got to understand that when you're thinking about policy, people look through multiple lenses, possibly not quite as many as this insect, but the lenses through which you have to look at policy issues are very complicated. In the case of energy, which of course is intrinsic to how we respond to the challenges of climate change, there are basically three very important lenses that you have to look through. You have to look through the lens of security of supply. If the lights go out, then advanced societies stop working, very dramatically actually. So that's one lens. The second lens you have to look through is cost, price, affordability, because that's an issue for all of us. And then the third issue, and these aren't in order of priority, is the issue of sustainability. But anyone who tries to do energy policy based on one of those lenses alone is likely to come up with a rather imperfect answer at best. And if you actually look at public values, because the engagement has got to be in the context of public values, then this is work by Nick Pidgeon and his colleagues in Cardiff, then you start seeing these different issues coming out. So here on the top, we've got 74% of respondents very or fairly concerned about climate change. 79% believe the UK should reduce its use of fossil fuels. So a good appreciation of environmental issues. But then 83% of respondents fairly or very concerned that in the next 10 or 20 years, electricity and gas will become unaffordable for them. So that cost lens, and note the word unaffordable. And then 82% of the British public have strong concerns about the UK becoming too dependent on energy from other countries. No alternatives in place when fossil fuels run out, the possibility of a national petrol shortage and frequent power cuts. So when you start talking to the public, you find concerns come out about the environment, sustainability, price and security. So it isn't just policymakers that worry about these issues, it's all of us. And then I think, where again the discussion has gone wrong to some extent, is that some of the people who don't like the policy implications of climate change have felt the easiest way to deal with it and not to have to confront them is to rubbish the science. Now that's clearly absolutely ridiculous. And what we have to do is to move to a position which says the science is extremely robust. Of course there are uncertainties about the future. But now we have to confront the policy options. And broadly speaking, and that's for all of us, there are three options. We can mitigate, in other words, we can reduce our emission of greenhouse gases by finding alternative sources of energy. We can adapt, so here's the Thames flood barrier, which will deal with rising seawater, and there are lots of other ways we can adapt. Or we can suffer. And the challenge is how we optimize the ratio between those three. And I think that the other way that we've got to communicate it is to say this is not all doom and gloom, because actually there are enormous technological possibilities and they bring economic opportunities in their wake. And so here, for example, is an enormous wind turbine blade, which is being developed by a company called Blade Dynamics. Now, I recently went to Narek, which is a testing centre for the turbine blades, and they are huge. And that was just the ordinary ones. There wasn't one of those there. There's nuclear power. There's carbon capture and storage. So these are the opportunities. But I think the challenge for all of us is to handle those issues, and communication is going to be paramount amongst them. Now, that's more than enough from me, and what I want to do now is to hand over to Professor Thomas Stocker, who has, I think, done a most incredible leadership role in bringing together this incredibly important report. And I could spend quite a lot of time going through your CV, but actually I think the most important thing is to give you the stage. So I ask you all to welcome Thomas Stocker, and he'll answer questions afterwards. So, Thomas.